Um,
Yes, Prachi, please.
yes. Good evening, everyone. I am Prachi Vansal, Assistant Professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. I welcome you all to this very interesting talk by Dr. Surbhi Kesar, who is a senior lecturer in economics at the Department of Economics at SOAS University. Um, the title of the talk is Informal Economy and Development in India. And we are really delighted that Dr. Surbhi has agreed to deliver her talk on this platform. She's one of the, I would say, uh, buzzing economists who's working on this area on informality and development now. She has worked on several projects in this area. Her work during the time of COVID-19 was especially very interesting. She received her PhD in economics from the South Asian University and has after that worked at several places, including as a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Massachusetts and as an assistant professor at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. I would not take much time and would rather invite Dr. Surbhi to now maybe take, say, about 50 minutes to an hour maximum for her talk on the informal economy and development in India. And thereafter, we can perhaps take a few questions from the audience. And so, yes, over to you, Surbhi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bansal, Dr. Das, for inviting me and for putting together this very exciting organization and group to be having this conversation. So on that note, I'm just going to start by sharing my screen, which I hope you all can see.
Visible. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, as Prachi was saying, that the broad thing that I'll be talking today about is informality and economic development in India. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience here who worked on this and related themes. So I'd be very keen to learn and engage with all of you in trying to understand how to better make sense of the problem. Today, what I'm going to be presented is sort of a mishmash of different kind of works, because I also wanted to gather more thoughts from the people in attendance about how can we collectively think about this issue of informality and development in India. And, we're at a very interesting crossroads across the world right now with, of course, rearranging and reshaping of how we think about development, a coming back of industrial policy, so to say, but also the manufacturing and there being a massive, deindustrialization that's ongoing, and hugely precarious sort of forms of employment are emerging, some which are akin to the traditional sort of precarious employment, but also the newly emergent ones in terms of the gig workers, so on and so forth. So there is that whole story of development. And then, of course, internationally, we're living amidst a genocide ongoing right now, and various other things that are happening really are pushing us to critically think about several of these questions in terms of how best can we make sense of these things in the current conjuncture. So, of course, there's a lot that I won't be talking about, but few aspects I kind of want to throw to all of you and sort of begin making sense of these issues. So my presentation is divided into three specific parts. The first part is going to be talking about, for quite a bit of time, going to be positing a theoretical framework to be thinking of it, which is sort of a development of various interesting scholars working on the issue of informal economy and development. And from there, I'm going to provide an illustration of the India's some illustration of how the India's development on informality and development in India. And from there, I'll talk about what are the ways in which the framework that I'm presenting can be developed, and provide some illustrative evidence, which is the second illustration, to talk about what are the ways in which it can be developed and where is it that this research paradigm, the way I'm framing it, needs to go forward. So there's a theoretical framework, and then we have two illustrations, one talking about the current development trajectory, second also talking about the current development trajectory, but more in sense of trying to develop this paradigm. And it's going to draw upon different kind of works, whichever of them are sort of co-authored. I'll keep referring to those as I go ahead. All right. So on that preface, let's begin. Let me skip over this and come straight to the problematic of development. So what is the problem that we are dealing with today? Now, in much of the literature on economic development, there has been a characterization of a developed versus a less developed economy. And the characterization, since Lewis's classic work, the Nobel work, which was published with the 1954 Unlimited Supplies of Labor paper, was this idea that a less developed economy is characterized by what is called an economic dualism. By dualism, what do we mean? We mean that there are two different segments of the economy. One that is broad. I mean, a lot of these categories that I'll talk about have various heterogeneities, and I will get into it in a while. But the broad idea is that the structure is fragmented. So to say, there's one segment of the economy which is much more traditional, agricultural, pre-capitalist, that is subsistence driven, low productivity, has petty enterprises, uses primitive technology. And on the other hand, a much smaller, modern, industrial, capitalist, formal sector of the economy, which is profit oriented, which has high productivity, high earnings, and uses more advanced technology. And much of the economy's population or workforce finds employment in the former, what is, as a quote unquote called the traditional sector. In contrast, a developed economy is one that is characterized to be a homogeneously modern one, where this fragmentation doesn't really exist. To whatever account it does, it's quite minimal, and overall, the structure is quite modern, industrial, vibrant, and dynamic, with profit oriented motive kind of subsuming all the sectors of the economy. Now, the idea is development was seen as a process of a transformation of this dual, less developed economic structure into this homogeneously modern structure along the line of a developed economy. So that's the sort of transformation that development was supposed to entail. This process, of course, entailed a lot of interrelated structural changes. I'm calling it a Eurocentric development project because, of course, it puts at its locus a very partial understanding of how development and transformation happen to come about that doesn't take into account the role of colonialism and various formation of ethno-civilizational hierarchies, racialization, etc., that underpinned it. So that entire story is sort of, so to say, whitewashed, quote unquote. And the whole idea is that this development would also unfold in a similar manner in the less developed economies. So in some sense, the story or the imaginary on which it is based is a partial one, is not a complete one. And then that imaginary is kept at the center or at the locus of this understanding, and all the developing economies are expected to follow somewhat of a similar path. So this development of a transformation of a dual economic structure to a full-fledged capitalist industrial economic structure is what we understand today to be development, or what technically more correctly would be called capitalist development, because it's the transformation into a homogeneously capitalist economic structure. Okay. However, there was soon a roadblock in this imaginary that the developing economies came to experience. What started happening was that as people were moving out of agricultural segments of the economy, most of them weren't really getting absorbed as wage laborers in this growing industrial segment of the economy. In fact, there was a huge pool that sort of was waiting on the periphery to be absorbed in the formal segment, or in some sense, what Meggy in a very old 1973 article called the peasant in the cities, where the idea is that this traditional form of undertaking production using only family labor, um, much less technologically advanced, subsistence driven, etc., was now being reproduced in the urban areas, in the industrial segments of the economy, and in a way that was market oriented, where exchange was happening in the market, etc. But the production was organized in the same traditional non capitalist way. And why am I calling it non capitalist is in terms of strictly the productive category of how production and labor process is organized, where it is driven not by profit but by subsistence, and where there is a complete absence of capital wage labor relationship. Or, in other words, there's no wage workers and production is being organized using family labor. Okay. Now, for the Indian economy, there's a hugely persistent informal economy, as it came to be called, despite a very high and sustained period of economic growth that existed. This informal economy was extremely precarious, poor, and vulnerable. So, what comprises the informal economy? There are two distinct parts of it. One is in terms of everybody. Sorry, I'm just going to have some water. So, one is what is called the informal enterprises, which is all the enterprises. Broadly, they are categorized as enterprises that have less than 10 total workers, statistically speaking. But a majority of them are actually these sort of family-based petty production enterprises that do not employ any wage workers. And just to kind of give you a sense, 50% of India's employment across agriculture and non-agricultural is sort of this family-based enterprises which do not employ any sort of wage workers, okay? And then there's this other segment, which is wage labor segment, right? Now, these are wage labor segments, but they could be employed as either more secure formal wage workers, or they could also be employed without any long-term job contracts and without social security, and would therefore be called the informal wage workers and would be a part of the informal economy. And I'm going to talk about these different heterogeneities in informal economy in some bit, but the broad idea being that this informal economy sort of comes as a roadblock in this entire transformation that was supposed to happen from a dual fragmented structure to this sort of homogeneously industrial, not just industrial, but actually capitalist economic structure. But that sort of comes isn't able to unfold, and the manifestation of it is this huge informal economy that comes into being, that replicates a very peasant sort of production process even within the urban industrial segments of the economy. So just as a visualization, think about a small mechanic shop at the side of the road, working either themselves or just using some wage labor, or some embroidery workers working in of themselves, or think about banana cart, person just selling the bananas at the side of the road. Again, we can talk about, to what extent they're integrated in big value chains, etc. But for majority of the Indian economy and the Indian informal sector, that's not the case. They are directly just supplying to the market. Okay, so with that in order, and just to kind of give you a sense very briefly about what is, sorry, I don't know why, forget the title of the slide, but basically this is kind of to just give you an idea of what's the workforce distribution in the Indian economy. We've got around 46% of something which is in agriculture, and of the non-agricultural employment, much of that is actually in the non-agricultural informal sector. So that is the extent that we are talking about. Within it, majority of them are own account enterprises, or those, when I use own account enterprises, they're self-employed enterprises that do not use any wage workers. And a very small proportion of the informal sector is that which does use some sort of wage worker. The distribution is 85 and 15% within the informal sector. So this is how the distribution of a country looks like. Now, of course, there have been various debates in the literature of how to make sense of it, right? And there have been various different perspectives from both what are called the more mainstream and the dominant paradigms, as well as something that are more critical or heterodox radical theories within broad political economy discourse. So among the mainstream, there's this idea of a dualist view where, of course, they think about informal and formal sectors as two distinct segments, given their distinct characterizations and different motive of operations, profit-driven versus subsistence-driven sort of a thing. However, in much of this idea, much of this part of literature, the idea is that informal economy is only a temporary holding ground for the excess labor force, which will be absorbed as there's a growth of the capitalist segment in the economy or the industrial segment of the economy, right? And there needs to be support provided to low productive firms in order to help them grow and transition into these, in order to have a structural transformation, so to say, right? You would know of this from various structural transformation debates and industrial policy debate where the focus is on, okay, we just need to make this big industrial sector grow and people will sort of get absorbed here, which we of course know that there has been a growth in that sector, but much of that growth has been jobless or job receding growth, even in some cases with very low employment elasticity, and this expectation has not come to pass. Then there is another strand within the more dominant paradigm, which has sort of become very important recently, is what is one can think of it as the continuum traditions, where they're basically saying that the issue of structural transformation is completely moot, where the idea is the overall economic structure is already sort of, that the transformation, so to say, has already happened. There are no distinct economic logics between the formal and the informal sectors, broadly speaking. Rather, they all have similar micro-entrepreneurial and dynamic potential and are profit-driven. And what we need to focus on is to release these constraints to growth. So much so that many of these studies, in fact, go on to say that actually informality is even a choice for a large part of the population. Just because given people's education levels and skills, that's the best that they can do. And one other thing that they say is that, look, there's actually a huge amount of transition across different sectors in the economy, and people are just freely moving across formal and informal sector, making these labor markets quite integrated with each other. And this is a point that I will come back to in a while when I'm talking to you about my illustrations. Okay. But the question is, what if the nature of the contemporary growth and development process in India does not square with such sort of a unilinear transition, or the idea that the transformation has already happened? What we're going to sort of, some strands in the literature have been argue is that development has not entailed historically, both historically and contemporaneously, this unilinear process of transformation. Rather, it has been a process of contradiction, where this expanding modern capitalist segment has a dynamic of the kind that it concomitantly reproduces this traditional non-capitalist segment of the economy. There are different ways why this reproduction might happen, and we'll get into that in a bit. But the idea is that it is this contradictory dynamic, rather than everyone just growing and transitioning to this big sector. We're saying there's a tussle, and actually because of that, we might not see this informality going ahead. So there are a lot of heterodox perspectives that talk about these contradictory dynamics. Some of them, for example, focus on a relation of functionalism. What is the relation of functionalism? Where the idea is, look, these huge informal segments, and a lot of them which are non-capitalist, that is those that do not have this wage labor relationship or are not integrated into big capitalist enterprises, they in fact help provide a reserve army of labor, which can be drawn upon by the formal segments whenever they need it, whenever they are, short of labor supply, or it helps keeps the wages in these big enterprises low, or these informal segments provide cheap food to people which are working in the formal segments, and also provide cheap wage goods, which sort of keeps the wages that has to be paid by the formal sector low. Or in other ways, in other instances, there might be a complementarity between the I mean, this is also a system of complementarity, but the idea is that all these informal segments exist in order to serve the interest of the economies of the core and are only transformed accordingly. So, if you can think about in terms of the dependency theory debates that have existed, a lot of them have sort of been talking about, look, they exist in order to serve some economic need of this formal capitalist segments of the economy. And so it's needed by them. And that's why this informal segment persists. Or there might be unequal exchange relation between, broadly, let's think about formal and informal segments as well, which doesn't allow the informal segments to grow. Of course, there's a lot of nuance in this debate, but I'm sort of crudely papering over some of this. Then there are other sets of heterodox perspective which also talk about, actually there's no complementarity, but there's this antagonistic relationship between the formal capitalist segment and the informal non-capitalist segments of the economy, where there are various sort of interventions, but let me just probably talk about the one by Prabhat Patnaik, whose idea is that when there is an excess demand of, let's say, primary commodities and food products, in order to ensure that the value of financial investments do not depreciate vis-a-vis these commodity values, what is done is that the demand of people in informal sector and in other sorts of peasant production are suppressed by deflating their wages, so that the excess demand goes down and the value of investments can be maintained. So in that sense, it again serves an economic need for the growing formal capitalist segment by acting as some sort of a cushion or a buffer whose wages can be suppressed whenever needed. And it's interesting, there's like a lot more work to be done, but of course we've been finding by work of Gendres and others that the rural wages have stagnated in India. And I think it's a worthwhile thing to also take up for more exploration. What I want to focus on here is the framework that we adopt in our work, and I've developed in a lot of my work with Snehashish Bhattacharya, and there are a lot of other people working on this as well now, is the theory of post-colonial capitalist development developed by Sanyal. And in a lot of our works, we sort of have tried to develop that framework more. And I'll be talking about the ways this research paradigm is growing and needs to grow more, and probably invite people to join in. Where the idea is that rather than thinking about a unilinear process of transformation, let's think about the process where, when there is capitalist growth, or what we refer to as growth, happens, it encroaches upon the non-capitalist segments of the economy. Let's think about taking up of land from agricultural and non-agricultural and formal sort of spaces. However, the people who are existing or subsisting on these resources, either land or other resources, are not really absorbed by this growing capitalist segments. And when these people are not absorbed, they are forced to reproduce their conditions of livelihood in some way. And this population, which Sanyal refers to as the excluded population, because they're excluded from their initial resources, let's say agricultural workers, or informal workers, taking up some markets, etc. When those resources are taken away from them by the growth of capitalist segments sort of moving in and expanding, these people are not also absorbed within these segments. So that's why they're excluded in that double sense. And in order to ensure that they reproduce their economic livelihood some way, they again organize their production in some way in these informal non-capitalist segments with low resources. So in that sense, this informal segment is continuously reproduced as a result of the capitalist growth process. So let me reframe it. The dualism that was supposed to go away with economic growth is in fact continuously reproduced as a result of economic growth. while it was supposed to be going away with economic growth. So it sort of places at the center that contradictory phenomenon between the formal capitalist and the informal non-capitalist segments, so to say. Um, Such non-capitalist segments are driven by the logic of economic subsistence and, like I said, and have this contradictory relationship with capitalist segments. There's some aspects of the Sinel theory which I'm not going to talk about, but he also talks about that these informal segment, then so to say, doesn't really serve an economic need for the growing capitalist segment. It's not providing, because we've got so much informality that it's not just supposed to be that buffer of labor that you can draw upon. Sure, some of the people from this entire surplus or excluded population can play that role, that the growing segment, for formal segment, can draw upon to, when they have excess demand for workers. But given just the sheer size of it, the whole part of it is not playing that role. More other than that, most of these enterprises are not linked in the productive circuit of a big capitalist firm as well. In fact, all this labor, all these workers are in fact surplus to the needs of the growing capitalist segment. Now, mind, this is an important thing because this is quite in contrast to the earlier theories that I was discussing, even within this critical paradigm, because there the idea is, look, this informal segment exists to serve an economic need of the growing formal capitalist segment. So everything is subsumed under its unifying, all-encompassing logic. But rather, we are saying that much of this population is surplus to the needs. What it does serve is not an economic need, but a political need. What is that political need? If these informal livelihoods did not exist, we would have, or a democracy would have a huge amount of population at its hand, which it is unable to provide livelihoods to, which can cause political instability in a country. And we did see that political instability when the farm laws were brought into place by the current government, where the idea was that there would be a liberalization of agriculture. Now, in absence of other formal or any kind of alternate means of livelihood, there was a reaction which caused that political instability in the country, and it was required that these informal segments do continue so that they can at least provide some means of livelihood for these people. Right. So I'm going to sort of skip over a little part of this, but one aspect that I want you to keep in mind is that for Sanyal then, the whole, there are various important insights from it, but few of them is in terms of it moves away from that unilinear teleological vision that, oh, there would in fact be with economic growth, a transformation of the economic structure of the Indian economy, which is fully capitalist, formal sort of segment, but rather of course, there are certain growth regimes under which it could happen, but he's saying that there is nothing pre-given in the process, or rather the contemporary growth process has been such that it reproduces this informal non-capitalist segment. But this is not to say that they are outside, and this is a side note, but might be relevant for some people in the room, that this is outside of capitalism. It is definitely a system of capitalism, but the post-colonial capitalism is of the kind that it is characterized by a coexistence of these two different, contradictory, intention, retaliatory, antagonistic spaces. And it is that feature that defines the Indian economy. So with that, I'm going to go into my first illustration. This is not a proof of the theory, but rather I'm going to talk about, we've been talking about broad aspects of the process of transformation, but there hasn't been a systematic analysis of micro level changes happening in the Indian economy, the nature and patterns of different transitions, and the impact on the overall economic structure and how it relates to the broader process of transformation. So I kind of want to illustratively detangle that a little bit better in order to get a sense of what's really going on in these spaces and relate it back to these theories. So that's the first illustration. Let me get into it. It's very detailed, but I'm going to just sort of try to give you a broad flavor of it, and then I'll move on to the next part. Okay. So what we're doing here is simple. If there's any clarificatory, stop me at any point. But we're looking at the peak growth period in India. We're looking at the India Human Development Survey from 2005 to 2012, which is bang in the middle of the high growth period of the Indian economy. And we're looking at patterns of household level transitions across different sectors of the economy based on the households from which the sectors from which the household derives its primary economic reproduction, right? I've also mapped it with individual level labor market transition, and the mapping is quite good, except for the agricultural sector. And I'll come back to, I can come back to that. And then we'll investigate what are the nature of these transition and how it varies with different socioeconomic profile. There's been a lot of literature in other countries' context talking about these micro level transitions. For Indian economy, it didn't quite exist until this work and some other work that I'm doing now with Rosa Abraham. I'll talk about that also a little bit. And with that, I'll draw implications for understanding this debate that we've been talking about, and sort of reflecting on it a little bit more. Like I said, 2 rounds of India Human Development Survey, which is the only long-term panel. Now we have a CMI panel as well, for which I'll show you some illustrations from it later. But it's a panel of 40,000 households. So a transition is simply a shift in the sector from which a household derives its economic and primary economic dependence. Now, like I said, the formal and informal segment is extremely heterogeneous. So we will bring in those heterogeneities, but without taking away from the fact that they're, okay, let that be the conclusion that comes off later. But broadly, the sectors can be defined into what are called the agricultural self-employed households. Now remember, self-employed are the households that undertake production using mainly only family labor. Then there's non-agricultural self-employed households, which is again self-employed, but in the non-agricultural thing, the banana cart that I was talking about, or the mechanic shop. These two are what I classify as the non-capitalist segments, because there's an absence of wage labor relations here. Then we've got other forms of informality, which is in wage labor relationships, and that could be agricultural or non-agricultural wage labor. You don't have to remember all these categorizations, because I'm going to give you the big picture. Not the big picture, but rather I'll tell you what it all intuitively means. And then we've got other sectors, which are upper tier of the informal or the formal segment, which is basically the non-agricultural employer households, those that employ wage workers. So those are those that we refer to as capitalist. And of course, then there are the salaried non-casual labor household, which is those that are employed in some sort of a regular salaried earning jobs. Not all of it is formal, secure jobs, but of course, they're not the casual jobs that we're talking about. And other households, which is dividends and rent payments. So basically, broad picture, you don't have to worry about these categories, but the simple takeaway here is the brown bar on the left is the proportion of households that derive income from primary economic, the major source of the income from this particular sector in 2005, and the purple bar is the proportion that derives their primary income from that sector in 2011-12, right? And the thing that I just kind of want you to think about is there's not been much change over these 2 periods, which is expected. It's a short time period. So the bars have been close to each other. There have been certain changes that are happening, but not a lot. But now what I'm going to show you is another graph. What does this say? This basically, let's think about, let's say, the non-agricultural self-employed, which is the first 2 bars on this graph. It is saying that 68% of households that were in non-agricultural self-employed sector in 2005 had transitioned out of it by 2011-12. But in 2011-12, about 65% of households from other sectors now constituted this non-agricultural self-employed. So what we are saying is, despite the overall structure of the Indian economy, what we call, a dual economic structure, there's no structural transformation happening, has actually not really changed over time, which is something that we find from the overall data as well. But the moment we look down and pierce underneath it, what we find is a huge amount of transition. A huge proportion of households deriving their income from one sector, in fact, has transitioned away. So 68% from non-agricultural self-employed have moved now into another sector. But the overall proportion of the sector in the economy remains same. Why? Because a similar proportion has transitioned towards that sector from other sectors. And that's the same thing throughout different sectors that we have here. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but that's the first sort of story that I want you to keep into mind. And of course, they're transitioning to all different sectors, and households from all different sectors are transitioning to the first sector, and that's the case for all sectors of the economy. There's a huge amount of movement that happens via the non-agricultural wage labor, which is your informal wage labor or the informal capitalist sort of wage worker story. What are the takeaways from this simple illustration is that in spite of the process of high economic growth, there is a simultaneous disintegration and then again a reconstitution of the traditional non-capitalist informal economic spaces. There's a huge significant role of casual wage employment in terms of people moving across different sectors. It also, like I said, it also maps well with the labor mobility. So what we see in terms of a stagnant overall lack of structural transformation in the Indian economy is not a stagnancy, but underlying it is a huge amount of churn. Now, remember, this will relate to some of the theories that we've been talking about earlier, but to keep in mind that there's this continuous regeneration of these sort of informal non-capitalist spaces, not as stagnant old segments, but ones that are regenerated with the growth process. Okay, now there's a huge section and longish section on the nature of transition. So I'm just going to talk you through what is it that I'm trying to do, and then I'll kind of just give you the results. I can come back to discussion of the empirical strategy later, but the simple idea is we have for each sector the households that did not transition to other sector between the two period and the households that did transition, right? Now we are trying to simply see that for the households that did transition, what would have been their income if they had similar returns to their characteristics as the households that did not transition. So the idea is we're simply trying to say that, there are households that did make a transition, and there are those that did not make the transition. We want to see those that did transition, if the broad idea is if they were able to get similar returns to their characteristics as the households that did not transition, how would their consumption and income levels be? And we simply compare this sort of counterfactual income with their actual income and try to get an estimate of whether their transition has been favorable or unfavorable. Of course, I understand that there are a lot of other issues with this empirical strategy, because the people who are transitioning might be fundamentally different than those that do not transition, and we take that into account in a bunch of different ways. For example, one of the things that we do is a sort of reweighting exercise where we give a higher weight to households that so since we're comparing these two sets, we give a higher weight to households that did not undertake the transition, but in fact, based on their characteristics, had similar likelihood to transition as those households that did undertake the transition, right? So it's through this method called the Dinardo-Fortin-Limor reweighting, and I can come back to it if there are questions. We also try to change our estimates by increasing them and decreasing them by half standard errors, and broadly our results are robust to all these sort of characterizations. And what is it that we find? We simply measure, the differences in their average consumption levels. Let me just show you the results. The results in this case are that despite this huge transition that we are finding across sectors, it is not that the sectors have become so integrated and people are continuously moving across sectors, which I said is what the continuum sort of paradigm predicts. In fact, the segmentations have remained extremely, extremely strict. So, for example, the people who are moving from, let's say, non-agricultural wage labor, which is the casual wage labor sector, to, let's say, something that is non-agricultural self-employed, which is your non-capitalist self-employed households, that's a positive transition. Whereas, let's say, if they were to transition towards agricultural wage labor, there's a negative transition. Similarly, if people were moving from self-employed, so let's look at non-agricultural self-employed, which is your informal self-employed sectors. For people, they're moving to employers is definitely a better option. Moving to casual wage labor is a worse option. Moving to some sort of salaried job, like a regular paid job as a wage worker, is a better option, so on and so forth. So the simple idea of showing that is that actually these segmentations, despite a huge amount of transition across sectors in the economy, have remained extremely strict. Now, so there is still an existence of dualism based or a fracturing of the economic structure. Despite a huge movement, the structure has not become integrated. But of course, the duality has become much more complex and heterogeneous in nature, given given this sort of changing fragmentation that we're seeing. In fact, we find that 62% of the transitions that are happening in the economy are in the way we classify it as unfavorable. That is, overall, people's consumption levels on average have been increasing over this period from 2005 to 12, so that's a positive sign. But what one is very interested in finding out, and what one finds, is that had these households not transitioned and been able to return similar returns to their characteristics as those households that did not transition, they would have been better off, majority of them. So it could be thought of as some sort of distress-related transition in a counterfactual sense, and that's sort of what we kind of want to bring to notice. I mean, one statistic that I can give you other than this is also, if you look at the average age of an informal enterprise, a non-agricultural informal enterprise in India, it's 8 years. Within 8, 9 years, the enterprise goes bust, and then people go on and do something else, right? These are different sort of robustness checks that I can come to later. And I'm going to not get into it, but one of the things was we tried to also understand what are the correlates of who is able to undertake better and worse transitions. Of course, uh, usual characteristics become important. Of course, there's education has a role to play, but a very important role is played by caste in the economy. If someone's from a more advanced, not advanced, sorry, from a more privileged caste background, they're more likely to undertake a favorable transition vis-a-vis someone from a marginalized caste household. So that's what this first illustration sort of talks about. One thing that I just want to give you a glimpse of, and then I'll move to talk about the last part, which is the second illustration, and also how to build this research paradigm more, is in terms of we also looked at the recent CMI data, which is a high frequency panel data for the Indian economy. And this is a work that I'm developing with Rosa Abraham, where we kind of just tried to calculate so using a sort of trajectory analysis, which is a group-based modeling of development. Simple idea is, from the data, we try to identify what are the major trajectories in the Indian economy. I can come back to the method if there are questions, but the simple idea is on the x-axis is the time. So this is just over 2 years, but it's for a high frequency of data, like every 3 months, the data is collected. And on the y-axis is basically different types of, so 4 is permanent salaried sort of work. And what we see here is also quite interesting. We do see a huge, so let's say 0 is out of employment. This is only the set of people who have been employed at least once over this time period. And again, what we do see is people who are able to transition into permanent salaried, which is like the most secure form of salaried wage work, is basically almost nobody's able, like it's not a dominant trajectory in the country for people to move to permanent salaried. People directly come into permanent salaried and stay there, whereas the different types of informal employments, there's a huge amount of flux across that. So again, just the point to put across is that we are seeing a lot of that flux and churning across different uh, um, employment arrangements, even in the recent period, because this is basically data from 2017 to 2019. And one last point that I want to make here is that formal employment and secure employment is basically something that's available to only 6.7% of the economy of the people who continue to stay in that sort of an employment. For a other vast majority, there are different kinds of other informal segments that they have access to. So let's pause for a moment. I'm at 41 minutes and I will finish in time, but I want to pause for a moment and talk about what are some of the reflections that we are sort of getting. And I have another illustration to get to. So bear with me till then. So what we see is a substantial proportion of households have transitioned across different sort of sectors in the economy, but the overall structure has remained more or less intact. There's a continuous regeneration of different economic spaces, including the traditional informal sectors or the non-capitalist informal sectors that are often expected to dissolve with economic growth. And much of those transitions are in fact unfavorable in nature in a counterfactual sense. It does not imply, despite these transitions, that, oh, we've got a much more cohesive economic structure, but rather there's still those strict fragmentations, but with a much more heterogeneity and complexity. It is through this embedded dynamism of people moving across different segments of the economy that this very fractured economic structure is being continuously regenerated alongside these non-capitalist spaces or informal spaces that were expected to wither away with growth. There's a continuous regeneration of a fractured and dual economic structure with growth process rather than a transformation in a unilinear sense that Lewis and other dominant paradigms further on had posited. Okay, so in that sense, this we sort of departing from both mainstream as well as non-mainstream views in some ways that either oversimplify this process of growth and transition, but also those that sort of just celebrate it for its inclusiveness. What we do find is this excluded population is being forced to eke out its livelihood from the traditional informal spaces for their survival. And one thing that's kind of quite important is that this process of recreating the spaces is happening during a period of high growth and this huge dynamism that we sort of see, which makes us question those unilinear transitions and also helps us understand the nature and pushes us to think that what if this growth process is in fact of a contradictory nature that continuously recreates underdevelopment and informality in various ways. Okay, now one thing is there's a various ways in which this paradigm or this framework that I was talking to you about, the Sanyal's framework on post-colonial capitalist development, that needs development, right? There are various critiques that have happened and the various critiques that have been taken into account. For example, how can one analyze the agrarian informal economy in this context? There's Sahil Mehra, who's been doing some work on it, along with Snehashish Bhattacharya and others. Then one important question is, how do these quote unquote economic logic, which is, that govern these two segments of the economy, interact with various other normative logics of gender, caste, race, region, religion, and others? And, in the context of informal economy, Barbara Harris-White and others have talked about various, some identity aspects of it. But then what about in Sanyal framework? How is it that we can think about it differently? That's a question. And then whether this lens can allow us to think about what we refer to as the southernization of the north, that even in global north there's this huge increase in precarious labor relations. Can this way of looking at capitalism and capitalist development as being embedded by this fundamentally contradictory relationship between an expanding capitalist segment and other non-capitalist segments, can it help us rethink the capitalism on a global scale and for the global north? And also, of course, what are the political implications of it? One thing that we've tried to begin developing, and this is the work that I'm developing with Snehashish Bhattacharya, is in terms of trying to expand the SUNL framework in terms of how it would integrate the dimension of caste. It's something that's very illustrative, and I want to present again some few illustrations of it in the next 5-7 minutes to kind of invite people to join this line of inquiry. Now, I can't get into the whole theory of it, but broadly, of course, we take off from works which do not take of caste as a static set of attributes. It, of course, originated as a system of control over resources and access and evolved in conjunction with various other social processes. Now, informal economy is, in fact, what we were talking about is it basically represents the excluded mask, the conditions of precarity, etc. And there's this reproduction of the informal non-capitalist segments. Now, caste system in some way helps reproduce the conditions of marginalization of a vast section of population that makes them more likely to be relegated to such spaces. And operationalizing caste system also helps provide an extra economic channel of segregating workers of marginalized caste to the lowest rungs of the occupational hierarchy. It aids a mode of exclusion through force and violence that displaces and dispossesses population from their resources and land holdings and denies access to common property resources. Given the fact, there are two things that I want you to know it here. Given the fact that occupational hierarchy was a channel through which the caste system was economically mediated, there's a clear overlap that needs to be sort of unpacked here. But also, given that caste system provides that extra economic channel of marginalization and exclusion, it is no surprise then that it can also be a channel through which this people being relegated into this excluded non-capitalist segment or informal segments is continuously reproduced. To emphasize the need for this integration, I'm going to provide my last illustration and I'll end with that. What we do here is we use the NSSO data on Non-Agricultural Enterprises Survey of India for 2015-16, which is like the informal sector enterprise data. And then we also use labor force data for 2018-19. And I'm going to just simply show you two simple illustrations. One, the possibility of those from marginalized caste backgrounds to grow and transition their non-capitalist enterprises is lesser than those from capitalist enterprises. So what am I saying? I'm basically saying that this process of transition or the process of transformation to larger capitalist segments is much more likely for those with advanced, those from privileged caste groups. And then on the other hand, I'm basically from the labor force survey, I'm going to show you that even those from marginalized caste groups that are able to transition to the formal capitalist segments as wage workers, they are much more likely to be under more precarious casual wage relations than those from the dominant caste groups. So in some sense, both the way in which one is excluded from the capitalist segment and the way in which one is included happens indifferently for different caste relation, centrally placing the need to integrate caste in any understanding of informality to happen. So caste plays an important role in framing the process of both inclusion and exclusion. So let me kind of let's just look at this one. What is it saying? It's basically the different caste groups administrative caste groups. Of course, I don't have subgroup information. And here, the simple thing to note is what we've constructed here is what we call an accumulation fund. Now, all the informal enterprises, if they're self-employed enterprises, most of them do not employ any wage worker, or a lot of them, in fact, actually have family workers and some, so this is for own account enterprises, which is all enterprises that do not have any wage worker. So for them, there's no explicit wage payment, so profits can't be calculated. We do impute some pseudo wages being paid to the workers in the enterprise and come up with an idea of an accumulation fund. I can go to the imputations if there are questions, but this gives us some indication of at least the minimum amount of fund that these enterprises can keep with themselves for a potential reinvestment and growth. Simple thing here, for ST/SC caste groups, it's less than half of what is retained by the general caste groups, which is in the group of others. And this is kind of to show that their possibilities of growth is much less for non-capitalist ST/SC owned enterprises than for the general caste ones. This is the same thing, but just controlling for different enterprise characteristics, and the relationship holds quite strongly here as well. So here the base category is general, and ST/SC has much lower possibility of accumulating funds for profit and reinvestment than the general caste group, because it's to the left-hand side of the zero line, so which means a negative relationship. We also try to look at what's the relationship of each of these caste groups with these different enterprise characteristics. And the simple takeaway here is that if it's a good characteristic, for example, let's look at whether they are in whether they maintain accounts or not. Maintaining accounts is sort of seen as a proxy for them having better human capital, etc. And again, the returns that you get by the fact that you have better human capital or you're able to maintain accounts is also much better for for general caste enterprises than for the SC/ST owned enterprises. I'll explain this in just a second. The simple idea that I want to look at is the following. We know SC/ST caste groups are doing worse in terms of the accumulation possibilities, or the possibilities to move out of these non-capitalist informal segments, than the general caste group. But we also want to understand how much of it can be explained on the basis that they simply have worse enterprise characteristics. Okay, so you give them better enterprise characteristics and that resolves the issue. That's not indeed at all the case. What we do see here, if you can see here, is basically a simple Ohaka blinder decomposition. And what we try to do is of the complete, so for the total difference in mean accumulation fund between SC/ST and general caste households, what we do find is that even if you control for their enterprise characteristics, a very small proportion of it is explained by their enterprise characteristics. And even if you control for the different states they are in, the different sectors they are in, there's a huge proportion that remains unexplained. A simpler way of saying that would be, if SC/ST caste owned informal non-capitalist enterprises were given the same enterprise characteristics, same state and sectoral identifications as those from general caste owned enterprises, they would still be more than 50%, they would still have more than 50% lower accumulation funds or possibility to transition to capitalist enterprises than general caste households. So there's much more mechanisms at play than simply enterprise characteristics, which is what policy sort of tries to talk about. So that was first illustration, simply showing that possibilities of transitioning into capitalist enterprises is much lower for those from SC/ST owned enterprises than from the general caste, and it can't be explained simply on the basis of characteristics. The second part of the story is in terms of what about being able to be included in the capitalist spaces. And here also one of the simple things that we find, I'm running out of time, I just have 5 minutes to go. So basically, I'll tell you the major result. And here the simple idea is, sorry, I think you're not able to, the sort of dark blue line here is SCSTs, and the lightest blue line is basically general caste, or the households. And then, of course, the shade in middle is basically other backward castes. And here, simply, if you look at who are, let's look at casual wage worker. So among casual wage workers, this is a graph of representation. Anything above this gray line means that category is overrepresented in that overrepresented in that particular employment relation. Anything below means underrepresented vis-a-vis their population proportions. We're simply saying general caste um, people are more represented in regular salaried work and underrepresented in casual wage work, while it's reverse for, let's say, the SCST, those belonging to the SCST households. Now, one more thing, I guess I can probably skip it, but one of the things that I want to, so we've talked about how the possibility to transition out of those non-capitalist informal segments is lower for those from marginalized caste groups. But the second thing is, even when they are able to transition to capitalist segments, it's under very different relations. For those from advanced, I don't know why I keep saying that, for those from privileged caste groups, there's a higher likelihood possibility to transition to more secure wage labor relations, and those from the marginalized caste group, there's a higher possibility to transition to more precarious relations. In fact, if I just look at the households with primary reproduction, primary source of income is self-employment, right? So these are our non-capitalist households. For households deriving their primary income from non-capitalist resources, and we look at how is it that people are able to diversify into different segments, different capitalist segments. Here also we find the diversification into whether they go into regular salaried or casual wage work is also extremely disaggregated by caste. Not just that, the returns that they get after diversification is also disaggregated by caste along the expected line, so on and so forth. But at the lowest sort of occupational hierarchy, even that difference ceases to exist. So caste is, at the lowest class, so to say, the caste disappears. Now, in the last 1 minute or so, I'm going to end by summarizing some of the key aspects, and this is the last slide. So what I started off was by telling you that there is a story of development that has been the anchor of much of the development theory since the development project came into being post independence, right? And that theory of dualism and structural transformation with economic growth has been a central feature. We saw a roadblock in that in terms of a reproduction of a huge informal economy in the country. And with that, a reproduction of newer forms of dualisms that were now being reproduced elsewhere as well. But a common understanding has been that with economic growth, these would wither away, or the fact that they mainly serve an economic need for the growing capitalist segment. We are saying we're positing a framework where that is not indeed the case. We are saying there's a continuous reproduction of the informal non-capitalist segments with growth process, and one of the channels which one needs to sort of which one needs to study a lot more is in terms of this contradictory relationship between a growing capitalist segment and informal non-capitalist segment. And it is through that contradictory relation that this dualism is produced. What I showed you here were two illustrations. One, to show you the nature of labor market transition or household transitions in the Indian economy, to show that despite growth, there's a continuous regeneration of these non-capitalist segments, which are not simply historical remnants to go away with economic growth, but rather they are continuously regenerated through economic growth. So that is the nature of growth process that India has. And second illustration was to show that the way in which the possibility of transition to capitalist segments through growth of non-capitalist segments can happen, or the fact that there can be integration into wage labor within the capitalist segments is highly differentiated along caste lines, which puts at the center the imperative to integrate a caste dimension in this framework of trying to understand how there's a continuous reproduction of non-capitalist informal segments with the process of economic growth. And with that, I'm going to end and invite you all to engage with it and think about these questions where I question the unilinear process of development in India through the reproduction of informal economy, its mechanisms, and its interaction with the identity dimension of caste. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Surbhi. It was excellent.
Thank you, Surbhi.
Oh, sorry, Prachi.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Okay. Thank you, Surbhi, for this. It was quite something. Especially the point that you made about the political informality being the political need is something that all of us need to think about and engage with more. Should we ask the audience for questions, or Dr. Surjit Das, if you would like to take over?
I mean, Surbhi was mentioning about Professor Barbara Harris-White's work. She is here. So,
Yes.
ma'am, if you can make some comments about Surbhi's presentation. Ma'am, can you hear me?
Hello, yes, I can hear you. I would like to comment at length, and it's such an original and dense presentation that my thoughts are not gathered. So I don't want to comment. I want to think and then comment, if you don't mind. I suppose one very basic comment that I have is, what's your definition of subsistence? Because your non-capitalist economy is variously alluded to during your talk as growing. How can it grow if it's producing for subsistence? So how do you define non-capitalism? And what is your definition of capitalism? Because as you know, my position is that petty commodity production, self-employment is a modern form of Indian capitalism. It's completely integrated into Indian capitalism and is not non-capitalist. But there's a great deal more to say, and I really want to praise the originality of your approach. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, of course, I'm absolutely elated to hear that, and given the the length and breadth of your scholarship that all of us are still trying to grapple with, I think that's a question that I think we've tried to spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'll attempt what I think is what our understanding is of it. So I think one disagreement or one departure that we make from a lot of literature is in terms of thinking about capitalism as not one that is governed by a single unifying logic of capitalist logic. Let me put it this way. It's not that all spaces are subsumed under the economic logic of capital or are integrated with it, of course, in a productive circuit sort of a way. Capitalism for us is an economic system that within it can comprise of differentiated ways of organizing production, some of which are capitalist, which we characterize as accumulation driven and organized by wage labor relationship, as well as a parallel non-capitalist segment, which for us is something, and I'll come to that second part of the question, is subsistence driven, but more so is not integrated in the productive circuit of capital and is does not employ wage workers. So in that sense, uh, the segment, which, as I was saying, the self-employed enterprises that are not integrated in value chains, that are directly producing for the market, and which are mainly only using family labor for the production of the for the production that they are undertaking. But the system is still called capitalism and not, let's say, non-capitalism or something else, because there is a hegemony of capital. Now, what are the ways in which capital maintains its hegemony? We can probably get into it, but it's slightly outside what I'm trying to argue here. But capitalism is defined in terms of its hegemonic relation in an economic formation where different ways of organizing production simultaneously coexist. And Sanyal's argument would be that the particular power of Indian capitalism or post-colonial capital, he calls it the post-colonial capitalism, and we actually take off from there, is exactly this differentiated nature. So in terms of when, your argument in terms of the non-capitalist is completely modern, and it's, I would completely agree, right? Because the data illustrations are showing these are not primitive parts that are continuing to exist. They are continuously being regenerated. However, in terms of the second part of that phrase, that it's completely integrated, I think that nature of integration is what we are in some sense debating and thinking about, because the nature of integration for us is not of the kind where there is an economic subsuming of all these spaces within the growing capitalist segment or within the logic of capitalist production. So which takes me to the second part of your question. What about how you say, how do you define this non-capitalist, and if there's subsistence, how can it grow? So on that, it's very interesting, right? Because they are subsistence in terms of that being their primary motive of why they continue the production vis-a-vis something else that is profit oriented. Now, we're not making a case that there is, so they are involved in the MC C prime M prime. So it's not a CMC circuit. Of course, it's a MC C prime M prime circuit, but the M prime minus M, the surplus being greater than zero, is the primary necessity for a capitalist enterprise. But here we are saying that that condition may sometimes be met, but in other times is not met and is not the sort of optimizing function of the firm, so to say. So in many cases, what happens for these enterprises is that if they are able, and this is something for which a lot more evidence, I feel empirical evidence is also needed, is we find some suggestions of it from the existing data, that if these workers are able, not these workers, these enterprises are able to retain more, it's not that this all will be redirected towards accumulation. Since the primary motive is the reproduction of the household, they would often funnel this to increase the consumption levels of the household in which this enterprise is based in order to meet what the Marx would call the customary standard of living. However, on other ways, when they have to ensure that the reproduction of this enterprise continues, many a times they would decrease their customary standard of living in order to ensure that this enterprise gets reproduced, which is, this overlap of the household and the enterprise space, and the enterprise not having its own independent entity as a capitalist enterprise would, which is driven by profit. So I hope that at least engages with some of the things that you said. But yeah, this is something I'm definitely thinking more about.
Surbhi, there are a couple of questions in the chat box.
Yes.
Isha, are you there? You can ask your question directly. Isha, are you around?
Yes, I'm here. So
Yeah,
my question
please
is
ask.
basic.
Yeah, basic, but it's a very interesting and important question. Please ask.
I got the issue. I just wish to know could you also come up with a solution how to overcome or get rid of this endless loop of reinforcement of the caste hierarchies and also reproduction of the informal economies?
That's a very difficult question. You know, it's so easy as in economists and as in analysts in general or social scientists to point out what are the problems with everything that we are doing. And what we find as the solution is probably something that's not what respectable circles would find acceptable. But to sort of, let me just sort of try to kind of, okay, so let me put it this way, that in much of the literature of caste that you see in economics, I can't talk about other disciplines, but I can talk about economics. In that, the idea often is it remains, so it has a very similar problem that the literature of informal economy has. How so? Because in both the literature, the idea is that with capitalist growth, there would be a withering away of these caste hierarchies in the same way there'd be a withering away of this informal economy. So you can have, you know, when growth would continue to happen, there'll be a dilution of caste-based inequalities because everybody would be pulled up through this growing process, so to say. However, we are positing a scenario where we are saying that the growth process is contradictory rather than unilinear. What does that contradictory thing says? It basically says that there's a reproduction of conditions of underdevelopment, so to say, because informal economy is a condition of underdevelopment, and we are saying there's a reproduction of that. If we are saying that the growth process is such that the conditions of underdevelopment will be reproduced, is being reproduced, and based on caste-based marginalization, there is certain groups who are more likely to be relegated to that excluded condition of underdevelopment, or forget excluded, to that condition of underdevelopment, then the fact that with the growth process, this would wither away becomes a big question, because we are saying that, look, the conditions through which this marginalization is being reproduced is itself going to be reproduced. And that there can be short-term resolutions of things in terms of more labor-intensive development in a third world consensus where we're not just importing capital-intensive technology from the, so to say, first world or the developed world, which is much more capital-intensive and stuff, which a lot of people have written about. But we're saying actually there's something more fundamental with the fact that the way capitalist growth process happens. So the idea would be to think about an alternative form of growth process that is not a capitalist growth process. How do we bring that about is, of course, an open question. Isha, I'll take your second question as well in terms of how did I go about calculating accumulation wages and what are the enterprise characteristics. So just to kind of wrap this up. So for what we did was, so think about it from the NSSO data, and I'm very happy to share the papers where I have expanded on this and the entire technical exercise a lot more. But where the simple idea is, you have an informal enterprises, you have the informal enterprise, and in these enterprises, you have the total earning, right? Now, for a regular enterprise, what would happen? You would take away all the costs, you would take away the wages that are paid, etc., rent, interest payments, and you'll be left with something that you can use for reinvestment and profits and so on and so forth. But for these enterprises, there's this overlap in the household space of consumption and the space of production of the enterprise. And there's no explicit wage payment. When the enterprise is organized using family workers, you're not paying a wage to, the mother, the sister, the father, and whatever. And what we do is we try to get a sense of what is it if such a worker was to work in a similar enterprise that does hire in worker, what would be the wages that would be gotten by that person? And we impute it based on those characteristics. And the characteristics are basically, education, caste. No, actually, sorry. No, those are not the characteristics. The characteristics are the value added of the enterprise, the state in which they are located, the industry in which they are located, and whether they are rural and urban. So based on those broad categorization and then imputing based on their value added, we impute these wages. But of course, we have a lot of things to basically show that it's a very low wage that we are imputing, because most of these enterprises actually, most of these self-employed people have a higher earning than what casual wage workers do. So this accumulation that we've calculated is a huge overestimation. In reality, they would retain much less for something like that, which relates to the previous question by Professor Harris-White as well.
Yeah. Abhavish? Abhavish, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Please
Should I
ask.
ask? Okay.
Yes. Because
Okay.
you are writing long questions here.
Sorry.
Please ask. No, that's okay. Please ask directly.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the talk. Very insightful. I have two questions. One is related to how do you view dependency theory with regard to this. Dependency theory has been arguing for long that, you see, dualism, the reproduction of dual structures are not something antagonistic to capitalism, but it is inherent to it. And Gunther Frank goes to the extent of arguing that it is in places where there have been very close ties to global capital that underdevelopment has actually become the natural condition of those economies. So, what is so specific in Sanyal's framework that relates underdevelopment or dualism to post-coloniality? Why is post-coloniality so important in this context? That's one question. The other question is, uh, there seems to be a tacit assumption that demand is not a constraint of growth in Sanyal's framework. Why I say this? Because it almost seems as if growth will take place in the capitalist sector. Whoever who gets displaced from the capitalist sector can go into the need economy, but growth is a permanent condition of capitalism and it will keep on happening. But I believe that growth is not a permanent condition of capitalism. There are many necessary conditions that come with which produce growth. So how does demand picture into this framework, and how is its relationship with informality? How can it be understood? These are the two.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot for that. I think both fantastic questions. So let me first take the dependency theory one. I mean, one simpler way of looking at dependency and Sanyal almost as complementary to each other would be that dependency theory talks about an international dimension, that the constraint to doing away with the dualism is an international dimension. If those international dimensions didn't exist, or those unequal exchange relations that you're talking about, this transformation would still be possible. What Sanyal is doing is saying, he's not like taking that. They may still exist. They may very well still exist, and they may very well be one of the constraint. But he is talking about something that is analytically domestic in nature. That even within the domestic parameters of the economy, what are the dynamics within the economic setup of the national post-colonial economies through which something like this might still exist. So in that sense, you can still have your international dimension. That can be one constraint. And we are saying that, but there's something internal to the dynamics of capitalism within these countries as well, which leads to something like this. So one way is to look at it as complementary in nature. But of course, Sanyal also departs from dependency in terms of saying that not in Frank, but in a lot of other later works, there is this idea that the transformation would still come to pass, or there is this idea which is very strongly there in the ideas that all of this is for the economic needs of capital. Why does the peripheral outside exists because it serves that economic need of unequal exchange, which helps the growth in the core and stuff. But Sanyal is saying that actually all these people are surplus to the needs of capital. There's no economic need, there's a political need. And that's the second differentiation. So I'm saying that it's a two-tiered sort of understanding. One is you can still be like, okay, there's international dimension, and we are talking about something which are the internal dynamics. So they are analytically distinct, so they can be looked as complementary. But then there's another level, which is a departure. And the departure is in terms of whether there's an economic need that this, and this is something that I always think about, that we are not talking about a small reserve army of labor that is helping a huge formal sector. We're talking about our norm being that surplus labor with a very small formal sector on the fringes. The other day, with there's this work that I started doing with Rosa Abraham and Ehsan Basino, which is simply just looking at the distribution of enterprises in the Indian economy, okay, from the economic census of 2016. We're talking about 98% enterprises being informal in our country, and the rest 2% being formal. Even if you weighted by the workforce that they employ, we are talking about a difference of 70% and 30%. So the predominant of what is that. So sure, that will help subsidize the formal capitalist segment in various ways, but is their existence functional to what are the needs of this segment is something that Sanyal departs from. So that's the answer to the first question that you asked. The second question is in terms of how demand is not a constraint. I mean, one thing, again, I've not thought a lot about this, but one thing that I would say is that without growth, the situation would be much worse. So I think we're sort of in agreement there. Even when Sanyal is not talking about an alternative of when the growth wouldn't happen. He, like how Marx starts with talking about exploitation by saying, look, I'm going to take your perfect competition as an example. I'm going to start with it and show you how exploitation is happening. Sanyal is saying, I'll take your best case scenario of high growth economy because that was supposed to be the resolution of the problem of dualism and this existence of non-capitalist spaces. I'll take that and still show you how surplus labor is going to be reproduced. When there is no growth, the situation will definitely be worse. And there was this nice piece by Roshan Kishore in Hindustan Times 2 days ago, where he's talking about the political economy of India and this thing. And he poses these two questions at the end, that right now the growth is existing. When the growth doesn't exist, then what would happen? Because these welfare, so let me sort of just give one small background. So one of the things about Sanyal's theory, which I don't talk about here, but it's definitely something that people should explore more, and I'm also keen to look at, is that he says that the development paradigm today that we are thinking about, and we did some work on it with Snehashish Bhattacharya and Lopamudra Banerjee, extending the COVID work in a political economy context as well, is that we're not, we World Bank and every IMF have sort of given up on the structural transformation debates, if you think of it, right? Like there's a comeback of industrial policy, however fashionably we want to say it, but they've given up on that dream. What is the dream now? Provide small scale loans, provide some micro, whatever, to make people subsist. Now, Sanyal is saying that that is a way of exactly legitimizing this political need of capital. How so? Because it provides just the bare minimum that you need in order to make this population subsist. So it's in some sense a governance of the poor. That's what he calls it, and Partha Chatterjee and others also build on it later, that there's a governance of the poor, that you provide this little bit to just make them subsist in some way, right? Now, in that situation, this thing of what Roshan Roshan was talking about is, he's saying that these welfare payments that have to be made to the space, when growth doesn't happen, it becomes more and more unsustainable to do that. And what kind of tensions that would emerge, that would bring in, is of course for us yet to see. So I'll end with one last point, and this is something that, I think is one of the important implications that we're trying to talk about, is we often think about capital wage labor as the main thing, that there'll be a transformation that will happen. And when the transformation happens, there's a wage labor capital dichotomy that will get magnified. We're basically trying to center that in today's Indian economy, there's a capital non-capital dichotomy that is as important as a contradiction as a capital wage labor dichotomy. And it is that we really need to unpack its very basis to try and understand what's happening. So demand is definitely an aspect, but this is the best case scenario. Without demand, it'll be much worse. Yeah. Thanks.
Upendra, I think Upendra has left. He was asking, is informal sector of the economy causing the black economy or not? Do you
Oh,
have
okay.
anything to say? Yeah.
I mean, black economy is usually quite a small part of this. Black economy would be like illegal. So most of these enterprises are not illegal. They are legal, but they don't even need to register or comply with. So, it's quite interesting when you send your papers to anything which is mainstream journals, they often get back at saying, oh, the problem is that these firms are not registering. And in fact, if you look at the mainstream debates on informality right now, there's a huge increase in how best to formalize them. The problem is not about formalizing. Most of them are like 90% of them are way below any sort of level at which formalization regulation even begin to apply, because most of them just produce at a very low level. So black economy would be much more illegal economy, but this we are talking about. There are, of course, times when they would skirt the illegality periphery, when there's a banana cart person on the road, you're not supposed to be there, or a small mechanic shop who has to pay a hafta to the policeman and stuff, but they're not illegal in some sense. They're operating in the fringes of legality, maybe.
Yeah. Shadab, are you there? Shadab was
Sir,
asking.
yeah,
Yeah.
I have just a small question.
Yeah, sure.
More, maybe the clarification. What is the role of characteristics like education in land holdings in household transitioning in and out in this regeneration of dual economy? Because in rural non-farm employment, we have seen that the education has some effect on getting jobs like regular jobs. So I just need some.
No, definitely. I think this is a great question. So I'll just show you the results from it that I find. Education does have an effect. For example, at the level of median per capita household consumption, an increase in 5 years of education of the highest educated adult is associated with a 1.8% decrease in the probability of, let's say, a self-employed non-capitalist household to transition to an employer's. And similarly, it's a negative relation in the other way as well. So yes, education does play a role. Similarly, land holdings size does as well. And I'm happy to send you this paper where we do discuss these results. So there's a positive relation and there's a negative relation in both the cases. But like I was saying, that if we are constantly hit against a barrier where the good jobs don't exist, and increasingly the kind of jobs that we have, there's this reproduction of informal thing, to what extent that absorption can happen is a big question that's left unanswered. And as I was showing you that trajectory graph that I showed you, it basically, what it does, it just looks at how people are moving across sectors and pulls out what would be the main trajectory that people would follow. And we are basically seeing permanent salary. There's this thing at the top, 6.7%. People directly enter into it, and people directly may retire and get out of it, but people don't tend to climb it. Whether education and land holding size on the margins are helpful, yes, definitely they are.
Prachi, please go ahead. Prachi has a question.
I actually just asked to get more out of Surbhi when she's here. So your work on subcontracting linkages is again fascinating. You've discussed this whole data set and as an illustration, but it's like informality within informality. Would you like to comment and sort of enlighten our audience who's here? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Prachi. It's like, this one of those good question was like, oh, I know the answer to it because, I had a paper on it and Prachi's helping me by asking me just exactly that question, which I can answer here. So yes, I did some work on subcontracting linkages, which sort of looks at these informal enterprises data over 16-year period. And what now, of course, subcontracted enterprises are distinct from these purely non-capitalist segments that we are talking about because they are integrated in the productive circuit of capital. They're not like directly producing for the market. And there's a lot of variation in the proportion that's subcontracted in the India's informal sector. Anywhere, it keeps going from 15% to 30% and again contracting sort of a thing. So one needs to figure out more of what's happening there. But again, subcontracting linkages have been seen as one of the channels through which, this classic transformation story. Okay, you get these big firms, you get them to subcontract with these small informal firms that will help pull up these small informal firms through technology transfer, et cetera, et cetera. What we see, of course, happening there is that the subcontracting self-employed enterprises or these own account informal enterprises have lowest or the least possibility to grow over like this 1.5 decade period. In fact, much of them are this classic sort of putting out subcontracting, where what is happening is they are provided the raw materials and design raw materials designed by the subcontractor, and the entire produce is then bought by the subcontractor or the larger firm. But they have no ownership over the production. They have no ownership over but there's no transfer of technology that's happening. So it's sort of that very expropriative relation that exists, and it's a complete putting out relation that exists even in this scenario. And one very interesting thing, I mean, we characterize it as a hybrid of a worker in an enterprise. Why an hybrid? Because they are not an independent enterprise and having their autonomous production and control over these. And on the other hand, they're also not a worker which is internal to the entire production of the firm. And most of the time, the common resources of these subcontracted enterprises, which are usually based within household, let's say the house, whatever tools are around the household or the household space, is being actively used for production, but they're not directly paid for it. So these common resources are being accessed by the big enterprises through these very exploitative subcontracting relationships in a way that these have least possibilities to grow these subcontracted enterprises than those that are non-subcontracted. So thanks for that question.
Surbhi, I wanted to ask one thing. When you were talking about this transition, 65 to 70% transition within 5 years period, this IHDS data from 2004-5 to 2011-12, I was thinking, there's this Himanshu and Deepa Sinha and Professor Nicholas Stern, their study on Palanpur. So what they were telling us is that although 46% households are dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, but no household does one single work. I mean, they are involved in non-agricultural activities as well. But the way we categorize agricultural households and non-agricultural households, etc., I mean, depending on the bulk of the income, if it is coming from a particular. Now, I was wondering that this 65% to 70% transition, in transition or out transition, could be just that the income from agriculture is exceeding non-agricultural income, or income from non-agriculture for some. So whether that, I mean, the way we think about transition, and if it is just that the income from one source is exceeding the income from other source, are not the same, no? So how much can be drawn from there? That is one. And second question I had in mind, that caste thing is very interesting about, I mean, according to me, if you control for the farm characteristics, rural, urban, and scale, and other things you were saying. And then also you are saying that SC/ST households are less likely to I mean, come up the ladder than the other households. So, what could be the other factors apart from the cultural behavioral factor called casteism?
Thank you. So the second question is very difficult. So I'll start with the first question that I've sort of explored a bit in this work. So one thing is what we also so yes, the way the households are defined in terms of their primary income, it is in terms of where is it that they're deriving their major income from. However, we also try to for I'm trying to look for the table. I don't have it in my slides, but for everyone except for agricultural self-employed households, for everyone else, for the people who say that their major, I mean, or rather for whom the major income is from that particular source, that is also for 80% of them, that is also the only source that exists. So for them, like it's not a thing of where is it that they're getting just more income from. For agricultural self-employed, I agree the situation is much more complicated. For them, this figure drops down to like I don't have the exact figure, but close to 50% for them. What we also tried to do was look at those where we classify something as a major income only if they have more than 80% of their income from it, and broadly our results stay as they do. Because what broadly I mean by the results staying as they do is that there is still that huge transition in terms of what is it that they're deriving their major income from. So if we are saying, look, in one period agriculture was their major income source, but now their major income source, more than 80% of it is something that's different. So at an 80% cutoff, that actually means a substantial shift. If so so that's for the first part. For the second part, what does it mean? I think that's exactly where we're trying to develop this work further. And we've not been able to pin down on something in trying to understand what those alternative mechanisms are. One thing that we're trying to kind of explore and think about what will be the ways to explore is how what are the mechanisms through which these caste-based hierarchies or the caste social process of caste, so to say, are getting reproduced? Because caste is not a monolith, right? Like it's also changing so much. So what we're trying to capture from the data would also be our prior understandings of this is how things would operate. We might see an equalization in wages and education, but still a reproduction of certain other ways. And it's quite fascinating that even to the extent of controlling states and sectors, like even if you take into account occupational segregation, different activities being done by different caste group and stuff, even then there's a huge proportion that remains unexplained. What could be the reason? I have some conjectures, but I don't have yet an idea, and that's exactly where we're trying to push this further into. That's the best that I can come up with. Some are just discriminatory things in terms of returns being different, like same things as education, the returns are quite different to the same thing, but the channels through which it is operating, we're still trying to get a handle on that. Yeah.
Right. Renu is asking, Renu, are you there? Renu is asking whether formal sector or informal sector contributes more to growth in India. Renu? Oh yeah, she is there. Please ask. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir.
I think her connection is little poor. Anyway, that's the question, that contribution to growth by formal sector and informal sector.
I don't
Which
have the
one is
exact
greater?
figure, but it is definitely dominated by the formal sector by a huge shot. Yeah. In terms of the value added that's going from it.
Professor Barbara Harris White wrote one piece, of course, informal sector in India, I think in Hindu newspaper in October. So she is making some ma'am, would you like to please elaborate on what you have?
Is there time? It's really a
Yes.
response to Surbhi's careful response to my gut reaction at the start of the conversation. But it's another very basic point, like defining terms. And it's how we understand informality, because you use the data, which is official data. It's the only data we have. And that data is about unorganized, it's about micro, small, it's about own account enterprise. And these are all legal and bureaucratic terms. And what you're doing, what you have to do, is to impose those legal and bureaucratic terms on your neo-dualist or new Sanyalian theory of informality. So you have a theory which doesn't necessarily fit the categories, or at least that's something that we haven't discussed yet and that needs to be discussed. And then you attribute a subsistence motive to households which are defined as informal, which get classified with other terms in the data, which make the obvious fact of a huge expansion by, in absolute terms, by multiplication of these tiny firms that we've seen over the post-independence decades, very hard to explain. And then in discussion and in your lecture, you've argued that these informal firms are backward and unintegrated. But if you look at commodity flow and financial data, this is not really confirmed. In fact, the opposite is suggested, that they are integrated through commodity flows, through finance. I mean, there are huge literatures on this. And I go on in my comment to say that it's quite possible that the evidence has to be gathered through field research and can't be extricated from the official data. And as you know, I work in the field and I don't have the competence that you have with these large databases and statistical techniques. But even Prabhat Patnaik, theorizing as early as 2006, nearly 20 years ago, recognized the integration of petty commodity production, which was his abstract term for what we're talking about, into India's capitalist economy. And yes, Surajit just paid attention to the fact that I wrote a short essay for the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy based on the NSSO conference in July this year. And there I try to disentangle an understanding of informality, which is defined through selective compliance with regulative law and selective enforcement capacities on the part of the state. So that's a very complicated definition of informality, but it is complicated, as you've said, and it won't go away if we don't look at these complexities. I'm sorry to have taken so much time.
No, I mean, thank you so much. Like, it's great to get these comments and for me to think about. I think, yeah, there's a lot that I think I'll probably just throw a couple of ideas more in terms of as I'm processing what you're saying. And of course, much of it is for me to take back and think more about. One, yes, I'm definitely imposing these categories of non-capitalist and trying to bring in a Marxian framework with the NSSO categories of legal and bureaucratic and stuff. But and there will be margins of error surely in that. But it also I mean, I know you're not saying that, oh, that's not useful, but the way I've thought about it so far is in terms of that it is able to give us a sense of the wage labor relationships quite starkly. And if that is one of the major dimensions through which we want to categorize this, then it does provide us a useful metric. Evidence through field research, I 100% agree. And that's the next project, because one of the things that I want to take up and something that I want to also apply for a grant to do field research is also trying to understand how autonomous the informal circuit and the formal economy circuit are. What is the relationship between the two? And which relates to the point that the third point that you made, which was in terms of look, they're not backward and unintegrated, but they're related through financial and commodity flows. And I think even if they are, I am not quite certain, and I'll think more about it, that it would refute their characterization as non-capitalist with their own logic that is distinct from the capitalist one. The reason I say that is because I am trying to define these categories in terms of the way their production is organized and their circuit of production, the commodity production that we're talking about. And if the relation with the larger capitalist segments are either as exchange through market, where they directly go and supply through the market. I'm not considering subcontracting as a part of this set when I'm calling them non-capitalist, but let's say if it is directly through market, then it's an exchange relationship which still gives them an autonomy as a non-capitalist category. And if it's through financial flows, then it's more of a relation of rent and subsumed class payments rather than directly through the productive circuit of how their class process is organized, if I might put it that way. Now, the question then becomes that then is it correct to categorize them as non-capitalist? In fact, I would agree with you in saying, look, yes, they're not backward in sense of being primitive in the way of historical remnants of the past in some sense. They are continuously produced. They are produced in very modern ways these days, and that is absolutely true. The integration then is what sort of integration? Is it an integration in the exchange relations and rent relations, or is it an integration in the production relation? Then there are two ways to probably think about it, is whether that distinction matters or that doesn't matter. If that distinction doesn't matter and we want to define capitalism as something where these relations of productive circuit integration vis-a-vis a rent circuit integration is the same thing for us, that's a separate thing. I wouldn't take that position. But if we are saying that there is something to be gained by understanding the productive relations and how they are integrated, which will of course be supported by these financial flows and other sort of a thing. I mean, one thing that's quite sort of a side note in this is that I looked at the proportion of households that take loans, either from formal or informal sources for these informal enterprises, and it was absolutely minuscule, which quite shocked me. And I agree that field research would probably expand my understanding of it, but that was one thing. Coming back to the main point, if we are of the opinion that that productive circuit does matter, and that's what like Marx was also trying to do in terms of putting these categories in their why these production circuits are important, then these idea of financial and commodity flows are extremely important, but in terms of defining other relations which are not productive in nature. Because I think one of the things is about defining capitalism itself. And in defining capitalism, if our definition and starting point is in terms of that a singular capitalist logic of production subsumes all economic spaces, then we are in a different understanding of capitalism than saying capitalism is a system with a difference where there's a hegemony of capital, and that hegemony could definitely function through these financial flows that you're talking about in terms of rent extraction and other things. However, it is a system of difference insofar that capital allows spaces of non-capitalist existence in terms of their economic and productive characterization to exist. Then we're thinking about capitalism differently. Then we have to think about rather capitalism differently, and we have to think about growth process, capitalist growth process differently, as one that is not one to subsume all spaces, but rather to reproduce that difference. And I think that's where one of the major debates lie. And I agree with you, it's an unresolved question, but I'm sharing my thoughts as I've thought about it. 100% agree, much more field research needed to really grapple with these ideas to understand them more.
Excellent. So if there is no other pressing question, okay, Shadab is also, Shadab is just saying thank you and please share your paper, etc. So we all should say thank you to you for your effort. I mean, you are speaking almost for 2 hours, you must be tired. But thank you so much. It was extremely interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I think we all would uh, start thinking afresh about the whole question. Uh, I mean, we are extremely grateful on behalf of the Delhi Economic Society. You are living in London, but you are Delhi Economic. I mean, you are our Surbhi. So, yeah. So I mean, it's like thanking ourselves. But yeah, it was really nice and it was very fascinating in my personal opinion. So thanks, Surbhi. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Professor Barbara Harris White, for your comments, for your presence, and also for, I mean, starting the discussion in a new light altogether. And thanks, Prachi. Thanks, all others who have participated in the discussion. And Prachi, would you like to add something?
I
Uh,
would just like to thank
yes.
thank Surbhi for this exciting presentation. Really a lot to think about, really dense. And thank you, Professor Surajit Das, for organizing this. This is the, I think Delhi Economic Society is doing really good in terms of the different kinds of lectures we are, organizing. And we hope for continued association with all the people who've joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for inviting me. This has been such a pleasure and like such a engaging discussion. All the questions and Professor Harris White's comments and stuff. It's just been so thought provoking and a lot more. I'm on my research lead, so this is so great. Like for me to just think much more about all of this. And thank you for having me. And as you said, like yeah, I hope I continue to be a part of the
Yes.
Delhi Economic Society and engagement.
Of
as-
course, of
Yes.
course. And give my regards to Snehashish also, is a close friend. So thank you, Surbhi. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks. Thank you. Bye bye.